Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Data Colada seminar series. And joining us today's speaker is Leif van Boven. And we have a number of great panelists today: Joël Inbar, Neil Lewis, David Sherman, and Sander van der Linden. In addition, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson will be with us as well. It should be really great. Leif, whenever you're ready, we're all excited to see what you've got.
All right. It's funny with Zoom, we always start with that awkward few moments while people point and click from a scene only they can see. Thanks for the great opening music as well. Airborne Toxic Event. I have a very close friend and a spouse who have a very healthy, if not slightly unhealthy, level of fandom for that band. And Airborne Toxic Event is probably a good, appropriately named band for this particular topic. So thanks for inviting me. Thanks for organizing. It's fun to be back in the saddle of discussing research in this format again. So I want to actually start by just kind of acknowledging my collaborators on this project and just sort of saying a bit about how this came about. So I was looking through my emails sometimes in mid-March. Gabby at the center here emailed me and said, we had been talking about some collaborative research projects. He said, hey, I've been talking with my colleague Olivier, and we have this grant to collect some data related to the ongoing pandemic. Would you be interested? And at that point, I was kind of stuck in just a state of shock about what the hell was going on in the world. So that instantly sort of jump-started. I said, yes, of course. How about we ask my collaborator, David, to join in this project, and two students, Jenny Cole and Alex Flores, who are first and second authors on the project and really have done all of the heavy lifting. So, in some ways it seems like our attention has been shifted recently to other genuinely pressing social issues and concerns. And in some areas of this country anyway, there is, I don't know, maybe a sense that things have moved on, that we're kind of done with the pandemic and time to turn our attention to other things. This is a graph of the cumulative confirmed cases per 1 million people. And if you think we've kind of moved on, we haven't. So we need to devote some really careful attention, both as a society and I think as scientists, about just how we think about the role of social and behavioral science in responding to and understanding the COVID pandemic. And David has really framed this nicely in our discussions, that in many ways what social psychologists in particular are well poised to do is to help us think about what comes next. How do we craft and communicate policy responses that will help hopefully guide our various societies and economies out of the pandemic? And what is really underlying our interest in this topic is something that we've been working on now for at least a decade, and that is trying to understand how the political divisions in our country and in other countries really create barriers to addressing these major challenges with broad bipartisan public support. So what are the ways in which the kind of political divisions in our societies make it difficult to implement successfully sensible policies that can help us navigate these challenging times? And in some ways, people have written about the fact that because the COVID pandemic is new, it's a shared threat, It's obviously a unique threat. There really are no kind of entrenched political positions. And so it might seem like we should identify a common solution, that we should really come together in a unified way to meet this challenge. But one of the things that psychologists understand really well is that the divisions between groups, and in particular divisions between political groups, are really quite deep. They really get to the core of our identities and our intergroup relations, and they can create substantial barriers. So one of the best and maybe oldest descriptions of the way these divisions kind of sustain themselves comes from Madison, writing in the Federalist number 10 paper, and describing here how we think about forming a country, a political system that can help minimize divisions between groups. He says the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. An attachment to different leaders has divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. And obviously we can imagine that the more vexing and oppressing there is, the more challenging it will be to design and implement solutions to the pandemic. This type of thinking about the nature of humankind and these political divisions has been long recognized by political scientists, by social psychologists. One of the kind of best articulations that shapes the way I think about this, I think the way David thinks about this, comes from Jeff Cohen, who in this paper, Party Over Policy, described the ways in which taking exactly the same policy proposal, but presenting that proposal as coming either from Democrats or from Republicans, would polarize people's response to those proposals, so that Democrats prefer proposals that come from Democrats, Republicans prefer proposals that come from Republicans, even when those proposals are exactly the same. And this procedure has been replicated in a number of domains. One of the domains that David and I have looked at is the context of climate change and in particular climate policy. And we've run now any number of experiments. This is a very, very robust finding in which we show that the same climate policy framed as proposed by either Democratic politicians or Republican politicians is differentially evaluated by Democratic and Republican participants in a way that aligns with their political identities. So in a paper that we published a few years ago, we showed that if you took either a carbon tax policy or a cap and trade policy, you could manipulate that to be proposed either by Democratic politicians or Republican politicians. In this graph, the Democratic politicians are represented in blue, the Republican politicians represented in red. Among the Democratic respondents, they preferred the policy more when it came from Democrats than when it came from Republicans. Among Republican respondents, they prefer the policy more when it came from Republicans than when it came from Democrats, and independents were not affected by this partisan framing manipulation. So as we considered a few months ago, what are the major questions that we might ask, given our understanding about the kind of public response to the COVID-19 pandemic and how we think about the policies that we might adopt moving forward. In many ways, our top line hypothesis was essentially that people would end up placing partisan considerations over descriptions of pandemic policies, that people would, to a very large extent, look at where the policy was coming from, whether it was a Democratic or Republican policy in the UK, whether it came from a Labour or conservative politicians, and that they would be sensitive to whether the policy aligned with their political identities, that they wouldn't necessarily look only at what the policy is, but really who the policy represents. Now, part of the reason we thought it was important to start here was that this is a very robust phenomenon, as I mentioned. There are any number of processes that contribute to this tendency to place party over policy. To some extent, people are signaling their political identities. To some extent, when we encounter a policy that comes from the other side, we apply added skepticism. If Donald Trump proposes a policy, I personally am just a little bit more skeptical than, say, if Joe Biden were to propose exactly the same policy. One of the things we wanted to do in this project was to explore a new explanation for why people exhibit these tendencies to be swayed by partisan influence. And that is this notion from the political science literature of what is called affective polarization. So there is this distinction that can be made between polarization on issue stances, how much do Democrats or Republicans support a specific stance, as in a climate policy stance or a COVID-19 stance. And that is a different type of polarization than the general sense of dislike and distrust that we might experience toward members of the other group. And so part of what we think is happening or might happen in this instance is that when the other side proposes a way forward to address the pandemic, our dislike and distrust for the other side is going to sort of render that policy proposal a little bit less desirable. It's going to make us a little bit less willing to trust that it will actually be successful in doing what it is set out to do.
Leif, can we interrupt for a second? We have a question from the audience that I think it's better to answer now before we move on, which is, how are the policies viewed when presented without a partisan framing? Do people assume that there's partisan framing underlying it? Or yeah, what? So what happens when you don't have that label on it?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. That's an important clarification question. So in the various work that we've done with climate policy, we have any number of manipulations of partisan framing. So one of the things I'll tell you about in a few minutes is, in the context of the COVID policy, what happens when the partisan framing is bipartisan. Understanding what happens when there is no partisan information given is a little bit more challenging because people have different interpretations about where the policy is coming from. So they will respond, many people will respond as though it is coming from one side or another, even if that information is not given. And so it turns out that, as often is the case, defining the control condition is much more challenging than defining the treatment condition, right? So just as an example, if we said the government has proposed a COVID-19 policy, most people will assume, rightly so, that it's the current government, even if no information is given. In the context of climate policy, most people will assume a climate policy is coming from Democrats rather than Republicans. So fixing those assumptions is really important for defining the proper control condition.
Leif, can I?
There was another good one. But perhaps, don't want to get too derailed on it, but somebody was asking whether it could be a heuristic if people don't have knowledge about the policy domain, that people are more likely to resort to in-group cues when they don't have any knowledge about it.
Yes is the answer to that. As I mentioned, there are any number of processes that produce these kinds of differences. Just as a kind of quick aside, so in many ways, the heuristic argument makes a lot of sense, and from a kind of ecologically rational perspective, right? It's very difficult to think through complex policies, and most of us just don't know. We have to trust someone to propose a sensible policy. So to some extent, the use of heuristics is undoubtedly a part of why we get these partisan divisions. And as one of our reviewers once commented, the use of heuristics is individually rational, but collectively disastrous. Because once we have this kind of affective polarization in place, it means that everyone doing the rational thing, what might be individually rational, following their own side, collectively makes it almost impossible to get bipartisan agreement on a policy that is only coming from one side and not the other. Okay. one of the things this new explanation, the kind of merging of these explanations, that part of the reason we observe these partisan differences comes from the dislike and distrust. One of the things that this helps explain, one of the things it suggests, is a different way to think about where policies can most effectively come from if our goal is to generate bipartisan broad public support. And in particular, it suggests that we really want to see policies that are proposed by highly trusted sources, not by sources that are going to be distrusted by large fractions of the population. And this line of thinking is actually really nicely described in the New Yorker. That was, did my video fall off?
Yes, it did.
Yeah, we lost your
It
video.
did happen. But I do appreciate the background image is a leaf.
Do you like the floating leaf? That's to differentiate the leaf from the lake.
Yeah, I don't know what my floating image would be, but it certainly wouldn't be that one.
Okay, give me a second here. I'm back.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. No, I'm back, but the angle has shifted. It's like one of those dramatic videos. Okay. Sorry, bad me. Okay. New Yorker article. This New Yorker article described the different responses to discovering that coronavirus was spreading in Seattle and in New York. And one of the central points was that the way that public officials communicated about the crisis in Seattle differed from the way that the public officials communicated in New York. And in particular, the Seattle public officials were much more willing to turn over communication to relevant experts.
Uh-oh.
That hasn't happened before.
Yeah, that has not happened before. Wait, maybe he'll come back.
Yeah.
Hang tight, everyone.
Hey, Leaf.
Welcome back.
I'm back.
Wait,
Okay, hopefully this sticks. Does not want to be navigated past. The relevant point here, in this article, they describe the Center for Disease Control's Field Epidemiology Manual, which contains this very clear guidance that communication about proper behavioral responses, about policy responses, should come from someone consistently who is familiar and expert and who is trusted. And as they quote Dr. Richard Besser, a former CDC director, as having said, if you have a politician on stage, there's a very real risk that half of the nation is going to do the opposite of what they say. So this implies a very clear hypothesis that a policy that might otherwise be polarizing should enjoy much broader public support if it is proposed and communicated by experts rather than by politicians. So I'm going to tell you possibly about two large-scale experiments that we've conducted recently, one in the United States and one in the United Kingdom. What happens in this first experiment, this was conducted in early April. We had a sample of nearly 2,000, reasonably divided between Democrats, Republicans, and independents. For those who are curious, the leaners are included in Democrats and Republicans. For those of you who know what that means, if you don't worry about it. And we asked participants in this survey to read about a policy about what comes next. That is how the United States might set a policy that would set benchmarks and shape its response to the pandemic and the emergence from the shutdown to minimize the spread of the pandemic. And we experimentally manipulated a couple of things. One of the things we experimentally manipulated was what type of policy they read. So some of the participants read a policy written by my co-author, David Sherman, based heavily on an op-ed by Thomas Friedman, that balanced economic considerations and public health considerations. So it's a much more sort of balanced policy that says, as we develop testing and contact tracing and the ability to really target hotspots, we will selectively shut down those hotspots, but this targeting will allow much more widespread opening, and so we only anticipate widespread lockdowns for 1 or 2 months. The other policy was one that I wrote with a heavy hand from an op-ed from Joe Biden. This one very much emphasized public health, much more so than on everything being shut down until essentially the virus no longer posed a threat. This would result in social distancing and sheltering in place for 6 to 12 months. So really quite substantially different policy proposals. So that was one experimental manipulation. The other experimental manipulation that I'll talk about today was a manipulation of where the policy came from. So some people read that the policy came from a Democratic group, including Democratic elected officials, liberal policy analysts supported by President Biden. Another group read that it came from Republicans, supported by President Donald Trump. A third group read that it came from a bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans, that it was supported by both Trump and Biden. So going back to the question from earlier, this is the sort of in-between bipartisan condition. And then a fourth group read that this policy was proposed by a team of relevant experts that included medical doctors, economists, scientists, and other nonpartisan policy analysts, including the organizations, the CDC and the World Health Organization. Okay. A quick kind of acknowledgement. In this study, we have a bunch of additional measures that I'm not going to talk about today. It's a big data set. We've really only begun to really explore its depths. So that will be saved for a future discussion. So I want to start just by showing you a lot of data. In fact, all of the data. And we'll start here, and then we will simplify the presentations a little bit. So what we've done here is we've plotted support in each of the conditions. So the blue bars are when the policy was proposed by Democrats, the red when they were proposed by Republicans, the purple is when they're proposed by Democrats and Republicans, and the greens are when they're proposed by experts. Within each of those bars, you can see the distribution of responses along a 7-point scale that ranges from strongly oppose at -3 to strongly support at +3. And then the bars obviously represent the mean and the standard error of the mean. The collection of bars on the left are the economics and public health policy, the balanced policy. The bars on the right are the policy that more strictly emphasizes public health. And then within each of those clusters, we have Democrat, Independent, Republican participants. So this is the full slate of conditions, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. I want to really just point out two kind of overarching main effects here. The first is that there is just really overwhelming support for all of these policy proposals. That in general, people are much more on the support side than on the opposed side. In fact, there's no group that is significantly opposed to the policy, although some of the groups do not significantly support the policy. Another thing that we can see here is that there is generally much stronger support for the balanced policy than for the policy that really emphasizes public health only. Remember that the economics and public health policy entails a 1 to 2 month lockdown, whereas the public health only policy entails a 6 to 12 month lockdowns. That's a fairly substantial difference, and it's not that surprising, and I think it's informative, in fact, that the policy support starts to waver a little bit when we start talking about being shut down for such a long period of time. There also is a tendency for Democratic participants to support the policy a little more than Republican participants, although as we'll see in a lot of these comparisons, that is a significant but relatively small difference between the two. Okay. What I'd like to do next is move away from the comparison across the different policies. So I'm going to collapse the two policies and look in a more focused way at the partisan framing effects. And so what we see here is a conceptual replication of the pattern of results I showed you earlier with the climate policy. So if we look at Democratic participants over on the left set of bars, they support the policy that comes from Democratic politicians significantly more than they support the policy that comes from Republican politicians, comparing the blue and the red bar. We go over to the right, among the Republican participants, they support the Republican proposed policy significantly more than the Democratic proposed policy. So that reversal of the patterns of policy support pandemic policy more when it comes from their side than when it comes from the opposing side. The independents are not really affected by whether the policy is proposed by Democratic or Republican politicians. Interestingly, for the bipartisan policy proposal, the level of support is approximately the same as if the policy came from one's own side of the aisle. This, I think, is important because it suggests that people are not simply responding negatively to the other side, but rather they're asking, does my own side support the policy? Is there someone who I trust who is supporting the policy? And in fact, their level of support is approximately the same as it is for the experts. Sandra,
Leif, can I interrupt you with a question here?
Yes.
Do you have a check somehow to make sure that people buy this? Because just as somebody who, pays attention to US politics, this bipartisan thing strikes me as sort of unlikely. Do you know whether people actually believe you when you tell them this?
I believe that they believe me. No, I don't know. In the past, we have included extensive manipulation checks about the believability of the manipulation. And even with climate policy, which I think you might even be more skeptical of, people are perfectly willing to believe that there's a bipartisan or conservative or Democratic policy proposal.
And we could also, just to add, at the same time that we were conducting this study, the Congress did pass almost unanimously bills, pandemic-related stimulus bills. So the idea that a bipartisan consensus could be achieved, wasn't impossible.
Just to tag on another question from the audience, Leif, if that's okay. I think that was asked earlier, but maybe you were getting to this now. It could be an interesting point to bring that up. Is that one thing I noticed in all of your graphs so far is actually that expert proposers seem to have a positive influence across the ideological spectrum. And the question from the audience was about science denial and science denial among Republicans, specifically in Fox News and misinformation and so on. And as you know, in a lot of my research, I find that expert consensus is one mechanism to try to neutralize polarization. So to what extent are you finding that here, and to what extent do you think it's optimistic that people pay attention to experts given what we know about science politicization?
Yeah. I want to hold that question for just a few minutes because I want to return in a more focused way to the discussion of experts shortly. Okay, so I'm going to hold that question. I want to instead turn to a different measure. So one of the things we often ask in our studies is not only do you sort of personally support the policy, but are you willing to convey that support to the relevant politicians? So would you be willing to send an email to your congressional representative supporting the policy? And just to note here that people's kind of behavioral intentions exactly track their policy support. So among the Democratic participants, they're much more likely to say they would send an email supporting the policy when it's a Democratic policy than when it's a Republican policy. The reverse is true for Republicans. Now, I want to now return to this question of the experts and the bipartisan framing manipulations, and acknowledge that the question here is slightly different. So, at least in my mind, the question here is, if we were to ask in general, how much does the American public support or oppose a policy? One of the things that is implied in these experimental manipulations, echoing the comments from that New Yorker article, is that when the policy comes from either a Democrat or Republican, you have some increased skepticism among a substantial fraction of the population. And so one of the things that then suggests is that if you were to just for policies that come from experts than for policies that come from Democrats or Republicans, and that's exactly the pattern that we see here. So again, collapsing across Democratic and Republican respondents, there's a greater level of support for the expert proposed policies than for either the Democratic or Republican proposed policies. And there's a marginally significant difference between the experts and the bipartisans, suggesting that there's just a higher level of kind of confidence in policies that come from the experts generally than from politicians, even when that includes politicians from your own side.
Just to clarify, that is also among Republicans.
So this is collapsing across Democrat, Republican, and Independents. Yeah. You see the same pattern for.
Can I just ask a
email?
Point, just a clarification? Sorry.
Yeah.
So all of your data is necessarily between subjects, but that particular point, I assume that people would comfortably articulate that in a within subject sense. Basically, if you ask them, which policy would you be more strong to endorse? One articulated by a politician or one articulated by an expert? I assume that, well, I would say everybody, but that's probably wrong. But most people would say, I trust experts over politicians on things that are technical. Is that true?
I don't know if that's true. We can't exactly ask that question in a design like this because the policies are exactly the same. So if you articulated the within subject version of the between subject design, you'd have to say, would you support a policy that is exactly the same that comes from experts rather than from politicians from your own party? We know from other evidence we've collected that people would aspire to say no, that it shouldn't matter. They sort of express that as a value, but we know in a between subject way that in fact they are influenced. You know, one of the things we haven't done, which I think is actually a really important set of questions to address, is in a within subject way to trade off the policies, to trade off the nature of the policies and ask, well, which one of these would you prefer? So we could say, here are these two versions of the policy. One comes from one side, the other from the other side. Which one would you prefer in a direct comparison, which obviously makes it much easier to evaluate the policies. And it's unclear to me exactly what would happen. If you present people with those two cues side by side, will they still respond to the partisan cue? I'm not frankly sure. But it's also fair to say that that's not what happens in the real world, right? This happens in elections when we have policy platforms that we respond to, but most of the time we're not choosing between two opposing policies. Okay, a lot of questions about trust in these different groups. So what I've advanced to here is measures of how much people trust each of these groups. These are within subject measures. We don't have a bipartisan condition here because they're just asked about the three groups. And so it doesn't make sense to ask them about the bipartisan group because they're asked to just have the politicians or the experts in mind. So, Sander, I don't know, what do you think? Among the Republican participants, there's a lot of trust in the experts.
Yeah, my sense is that often, in these correlational surveys, you find skepticism, but then in experiments where you actually expose people to experts, people don't necessarily react in a negative way. And so, I find that contradiction quite interesting. So are they exposed to a treatment here?
They're not, well, yes and no. So in this measure, they're not exposed to a treatment, but this is a measure that comes later in the survey after they've been exposed to one of the treatments. We've looked whether our experimental manipulations moderate response to these trust items, and they don't at all. There's no effect there.
That's very interesting. Well, the party over policy, I mean, that seems clear, but then, this expert stuff seems like a really positive response in some way, a bit optimistic news for a change. Although there were a bunch of questions from the audience, and I didn't see this slide, that independents appear to be the most skeptical of experts. Is that true in the data?
Well, it depends what you mean by skeptical. So the measure I'm displaying here is a measure of trust. And yeah, let's spend some time on this. So the independents have lower levels of trust in the experts, but it's still trust, right? It's still very much on the positive side of this bipolar scale, and they clearly trust the experts more than they trust politicians. Among the Republicans, so Sandra, this goes back a little bit to some of your work. We haven't done this calculation exactly, so. And I'm eyeballing here a scatter plot with 1,800 respondents in it. So forgive me for not doing the exact calculations. But if you frame the question in a different way, in an approach we've taken with belief in climate change. So if you ask the question, among people who are skeptical of experts, are they more likely to be Republican than Democrat? That almost certainly is true. So if we look at the dots on the lower part of the graph, the green dots on the lower part of the graph, it looks to be the case, again, eyeballing, that Republicans are more common than Democrats. But I wouldn't characterize that as really capturing the general tendency among Republicans, which is to express very high levels of support of the experts. So I think both of those things can be true, that experts are widely trusted, but that given skepticism of experts, the person is more likely to be Republican than Democrat.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important point, because there are these two literatures that clearly show that, Republicans have less trust in science and experts and so on, but at the same time, that doesn't mean, and you're showing that here, so I found that quite fascinating.
That's right. And in fact, we can see that here too. They have the Republicans are less trusting than the Democrats, but you wouldn't characterize them as mistrusting.
Leif, so this thing about the independents struck me earlier as well. So it's true that here, they are still on the positive side. So they say they trust experts. But if you look back at the policy support, it looks like the policy didn't really get a benefit for being proposed by experts, specifically among the independent group, right? So it seemed for them, it looked to me like they generally supported all the policies less the independents did. And on top of that, the policies proposed by experts for independents weren't any more compelling than policies proposed by any other group.
Yuel, can I just say the audio quality from that microphone is so great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's really nice to hear.
It's almost like you're a professional podcaster. One of the things that is, well, it's just true in the data. I'm not sure what to make of it. So the differences in policy support are consistent with expectation, but these are relatively small effect sizes. I mean, just, the variance explained is not huge, 1 or 2 to 3%. The differences in trust are huge. And we've seen this in other areas, right? That the kind of affective polarization characterized by distrust and dislike, we don't measure liking here, so we don't know that in this case. But the affective polarization is much, much greater than the actual polarization on the issues. And I think we need to do a better job of understanding why that is. And I think it suggests that the direction of causality between trust and policy support is really running from trust to policy support. It's probably unlikely to go in the opposite direction. But this is something that it's a very disturbing trend, and it's one that we haven't really, I say we as a field, I don't think we really have a firm grasp on why we observe these really sharp differences on these subjective kind of feeling responses that are not reflected in drastically different policy stances. That would make some sense, right? That we disagree whether because we have such different views on what policies are sensible responses, but that's not what seems to be happening. It seems to be that the dislike is really driving lower levels of support that are then somewhat more moderate than the dislike themselves. Okay. There's mediation. Let me do a quick summary, and then I want to tell you about the replication that we've done with a UK sample. So there are a number of findings that fall out from this. First of all, there's generally broad public support, and I think that's really important to keep in mind, right? That we're not sort of splitting support in opposition to the policy, that across all of the conditions, for the most part, people support the policies. There's greater support for a policy that balances kind of economic considerations and public health with shorter lockdown. Not surprising, but obviously very important. There is a tendency for people to be swayed by partisan considerations. They like policies more that come from their own side than from the other side. There also is much stronger support for expert policies and bipartisan policies than policies that come from politicians. And we would argue that is somewhat explained by differential trust in experts versus politicians, particularly the distrust of politicians from the opposing group. One of the questions that often comes up when we present this kind of work is whether this is really a US phenomenon, whether this is something unique to the kind of distrust, dislike, animosity between parties in the US. And there have been a number of papers that have looked at the effect of partisan framing manipulations in other countries. It seems to be that in other countries, those effects are somewhat smaller, but that comparison is actually really difficult to make because you almost always have a confound between the issue being considered and the country in which it is considered. So one of the things that we can actually do, given that this is a shared worldwide threat, is examine whether we would observe similar types of partisan framing effects in the UK. Obviously, the US and the UK are different in a number of ways. We also have some similarities. Recent highly polarizing votes, election of conservative populist political leaders that I suspect are met with quite a bit of distrust from the other side. So I want to tell you quickly about a follow-up experiment that we did a few weeks later in the United Kingdom. The design is very, very similar. So again, we've got a sample of about nearly 2,000 respondents, roughly evenly divided between those who identify primarily as Labour or Conservative. In this study, we don't manipulate the nature of the policy, so everyone reads the same policy proposal. This includes many of the features that were in the public health policy that I described earlier, so lockdown period of about 6 to 12 months. And we experimentally manipulate where the policy comes from. So some participants read that it comes from a Labour group, members of parliament, the shadow secretaries, prominent left-wing policy analysts. Other participants read that it comes from conservative group, members of parliament, supported by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And then a third group reads, just like they did in the last experiment, that the policy is proposed by experts. Obviously, we did not include a bipartisan group in this experiment. So let's first look at policy support. In general, there is well, we see some similarities in the patterns. So in general, there is support, broad support for the policy, much more support than opposition to the policy. There is a small, we'll generously call it a directional partisan framing effect here. So if we look at the conservative politicians, they support the conservative policy more than the Labor policy. That preference for the conservative policy is smaller, but not reversed among the Labor participants. So we don't see this kind of crossover that we have seen in the US context. Pattern of part framing effects would be willing to send an email. So again, for the conservative participants over on the right, they're more willing to send an email when it's a conservative proposed policy than Labor proposed policy. For the Labor participants, the reverse is true. More willing to send an email for the Labor proposed policy than the conservative proposed policy. The participants of the other party, the independents, the undecideds, we're still not sure exactly how to refer to them. They're actually very few in the sample, only about 66, and there's no real discernible pattern in their willingness to send an email here. If we collapse across both groups, we see, as we did in the US, that the policy proposed by experts enjoys significantly higher support than the policy proposed by politicians, and people are more willing to write a supporting email to the member of parliament. The policy comes from experts than when it comes from politicians. If we turn to the measure of trust, we see a very similar pattern that we saw in the US data. Participants trust politicians from their own party more than politicians from the opposing party, whom they actively distrust, but the highest levels of trust far and away are of the experts, the medical scientists, economists, and policy analysts. Pausing for questions. No questions.
Leif, actually, I have a question. So I'm wondering, like, about the boundaries of this. Like, let's say at the beginning, Donald Trump comes out fervently in support of investing in more money to find a vaccine for COVID, right? So, like, that's probably something that no one would think would be a partisan issue, but like, that's the thing that he keeps saying. He's clearly going to get credit for it if a bill passed that gives more money to, say, the biomedical industry to find a cure. Is that the kind of thing that will also show this effect, or does it have to be a policy that people believe the different sides to disagree about?
No. In fact, there's no reason to suspect it would be a policy that people believe the sides to disagree about. In the work that we've done on climate policy, that is a domain where I think it's generally understood that climate policy is more of a Democratic issue than a Republican issue. But people are quite willing to believe these experimental manipulations. And I think, frankly, we as academics often give people too much credit for their knowledge of what specifically each side believes in ideologically or in terms of specific policy proposals. I forget exactly the kind of relevant number, but I think it's something like 30% of people in the US don't fully recognize which party is the more conservative party if you ask them about specific policy stances. So I think there's just, people just don't, they're not nearly as informed as experts, academics who spend a lot of their time wondering about these issues. So I think there's tremendous flexibility at the kind of broad population level in where people are responding to these partisan cues, because there's a lot of flexibility in what they are willing to believe.
So then is there sort of nothing Donald Trump can propose that wouldn't make Democrats like that proposal less, or Republicans like that proposal more? Like literally, is everything out of his mouth like seen through a partisan lens and liked more by Republicans and disliked more by Democrats?
I mean, I would argue, I think the train of relevant theory is that you can't help but see it somewhat through a partisan lens. Like that's not in our psychological makeup to completely divorce the proposal from where it comes from, right? It's not something that the mind is capable of doing. At the same time, in these data that, many people are willing to support a policy that comes from someone they really distrust. In some ways, that's kind of pushing the bounds of what we might characterize as psychologically plausible. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that to some extent, people do respond to the policy. Part of the reason why that manipulation of the length of the lockdown, I think, is so informative is that this is something people are experiencing right now. This is not, even climate change. I know we're experiencing climate change right now, but not in as acute a way as our whole town is shut down and we've lost our livelihoods. I mean, people understand what this means. And in context, sensitive to where the policy comes from, which is not to say that they're ignoring the facts, but in addition to the relevant facts of the policy, they incorporate this other information.
If I could just follow up in response to Joe's question, there's the distinction between a government response, which could be introduced by experts, and a politician's response. And this is what Leif was referring to before when he was talking about the CDC's recommendations that it not be politicians who introduce the policy. And in many parts of the world, as we're looking at different responses to the pandemic, the responses are not articulated by the politicians in charge, the prime minister or the president, but by the relevant public health authorities. So if the Trump administration advocated for what you suggested, but through the relevant expert, they could potentially get the same sort of credit, but without the hostility that would be, automatically activated among people who don't support the president.
That all makes sense. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, actually, a really important question that someone should put on their list of research questions to investigate is it possible for politicians to sort of bask in the glory of the trust in experts? So I've often said, in some ways, this should be an easy communication problem for politicians. They stand up, they say, here's the expert, and I'm going to turn it over to the expert. Thank you for helping us deal with this challenging time, and then stand back. And it seems to me that the politician is maybe then able to enjoy some of that halo effect of the trusted expert, but that in the US and the UK is not always what we've seen. Instead, we see the politician sort of taking center stage. I want to pose just two kind of broad questions that I think is useful for us as a discipline and for just sort of curious onlookers and thinkers about these issues. And the first question is, in these genuinely unprecedented time, what is good for psychology? What is this time allow us to investigate in ways that we couldn't necessarily investigate in other contexts? And I've been struck by reading these summaries of atmospheric scientists and environmental health scientists using the sharp decrease in air pollution, using this moment to really understand what happens when you have such a drastic change to the pollutants in the atmosphere. And I think in a similar way, the pandemic is really it's an opportunity for psychology to see what good our theories are in terms of making sense of people's everyday responses. Do we actually articulate theories that help us understand the general lived response of people suffering through this pandemic? And in some sense, if our theories don't help us make sense of these kinds of challenging times, then really what good are those theories? One of the things we're kind of international collaborative group, and this will hopefully help us address some much larger questions about what are the sort of cultural differences across different regions of the world that have responded to the crisis in different ways. And I think it's also useful for us to kind of reverse the question, not what is good for psychology, but really what is psychology good for? And I know several of you have co-authored a paper to kind of answer this question. My own view is that we need a little bit of humility here, that if we just look at the results of our studies, we explain a significant fraction of the variance, but not a huge fraction of the variance in terms of who supports which policy. In general, people support any policy that is sensible and well explained. And that's important for us to understand, because it means that clearly communicating a policy response can be very effective in garnering broad public support. It's also very clear that people are more supportive of policies when they come from experts than when they come from the politicians who are polarizing, exactly as that New Yorker article illustrated. So one way to think about this is these results provide a scientific basis for why we need a lot more of this and a lot less of this. So no head slapping by the experts behind the politician. And I'll stop there.
Well, that was excellent, Leif. Thank you so much for presenting this work, and thanks to all of our panelists for being here. And just as a final reminder to the larger audience, all of your questions and comments are saved so that Leif and David can read through them afterwards. And all of this is recorded, and barring something surprising, that video will be available on YouTube sometime in the near future for people to come back to. So thanks again, everybody, for joining.